series of presentations where we are trying to capture that economic dimension in particular, using a variety of sources, both globally with the presentation by Professor Henderson and the presentation by Benjamin Stewart, but also zooming in, what can we do in Europe? Could we use the labor force survey to get more information about the economic performance of individual cities and metropolitan areas? And then we'll take another global look at with Frederick Hubler from UNESCO. So I'm really keen to learn and listen from these presentations. Also my pleasure to introduce Alessandro Rinaldi. He's a head of unit at the Joint Research Center, and he will be our moderator for the day, and also very active in the SDG realm. He, together with Alice, also put together the handbook for the voluntary local reviews, so we're in good hands there. And with that, I hand over and hope we all have a very interesting session and discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luis, although you stole my thunder, actually. I'm very pleased to be here with you and to moderate the session in this workshop on economic indicators to measure the performance of cities. It's a very intriguing, I think, subject. As Luis said, the official, I would say, SDG indicators, array of indicators, does not include one on the economic performance of cities, and also because we also would like to understand exploratory indicators, proposals, suggestions to actually get to the point. Today we have four distinguished presenters. It's Professor John Vernon Henderson from the London School of Economics, Benjamin Stewart from the World Bank, Johan van der Valk from Statistics Netherlands, and Friedrich Hubler from UNESCO. So I would not spend more words on this. I'm eager to listen to the presenters. Each presenter will have around 15 minutes, and then so we can spare time for a lively and fruitful discussion. I would like to pass the floor to Professor Henderson. He will be talking on living standards measurement and demographic and health outcomes by degree of urbanization. So, Professor Henderson, the floor is yours.
Okay, just uploading it. Okay, I hope that's visible. Okay, so I'm going to talk about living standards, public services, and health outcomes. The outline, I'm going to talk about three conceptual issues, and briefly talk about the data, and talk about some results, and make a few final comments in the short time allotted here. So the first conceptual issue concerns public services themselves. We expect the cost of public service delivery will vary with density, that certain services and access to services such as healthcare are much lower and access easier at higher densities. However, if the public sector is striving for equal provision, it's not clear they should, but if that's a goal, then there should not really be regional disparities within a country. Equal service delivery, however, does not mean equal uptake. There's a major sorting differences that for a given supply, the uptake by different socioeconomic groups may differ. And that's important in looking at results, whether if you're looking at density or urban-rural differences, are we controlling for demographic characteristics which rise as you go to higher density or not. And one would like to compare migrants with incumbents, but there's little evidence on that, and we don't really pursue that here. The second conceptual issue, which is a big one in the economics literature, is are there too few or too many people who've migrated to cities? That Golan and co-authors in a paper from now a dozen or 15 years ago noted this consumption gap between people living in urban rural areas, even after allowing for demographic differences in terms of education and age. Other papers have noted the income gains or the wage gains to moving to higher density. A recent paper by Golan, Kirschberger, and other co-authors found that services in Africa at least improved for what they looked at as you move to higher density places or to cities. That the better incomes and better services were not explained by cost of living differentials in terms of trying to equalize utility, for example. That's a claim in Glaser, a paper in Glaser looking at 4 countries, but the data on cost of living is pretty poor. The US, there are about 60% differences between small cities and big cities in the cost of living. We just don't know what that gap is in developing countries. But the idea in these papers is there's kind of money left on the table. The more people move to cities, they earn higher income, and there must be a disequilibrium. Well, modern modeling says, there's really no such thing as a disequilibrium. We're always in some kind of equilibrium. And here it's explained by moving costs and attachment. So older people are attached to the place where they've been all their life, and they're not about to move to cities. And it's younger people who move, but some of them have attachment too and are prepared to accept income gaps, even in developed countries. The issue that we're going to raise here is that it may be that there are certain urban disamenities that haven't been captured and are unappreciated in the literature, and that there is a downside to urbanization that we'll show. The policy issues, a whole bunch of them, but there is the key issue of the role of political and institutional status. Do equal density places differ in servicing by their, say, census status? Are they urban or are they rural? Are they a national capital or a provincial capital? In the work we did in the volume for the EU, the answer was yes. I'll look at that at the end briefly, but I'll tell you what it is now because I probably won't have time. That there is a small difference by urban-rural status, but there are bigger differences by whether you're a national capital or a regional capital. Being so gives you better services, accounting for demographics and everything else. If service is spatially biased, that affects migration decisions. There's primacy in the pull of national capital, megacities that have better services. And then another feature is that in Africa in particular, once you move outside the primate city into secondary and tertiary cities, there are a huge number of farmers living in urban areas, we think, to get services and to provide better employment opportunities for their families. And when I say disproportion, I'm talking 30–40% of people report their primary occupation as being farming, even though they're living in a city. So the data we use is the demographic and health surveys. A lot of it is from Africa. We also cover India, Bangladesh, a few Southeast Asian countries, and some Latin American countries. I'm not going to go through the list. We have the living standards data from the World Bank for 6 African countries, including Ethiopia and Nigeria. So this covers, hundreds of millions of people. And we have some data on crime from Afrobarometer. The outcomes, a whole bunch of them. I'm not going to list them. You'll see them as we get into the results. There are 2 ways this is important of handling space. You can treat space as a continuum of continuous density, and a lot of what I present will do that. That comes from a paper that came after the EU volume that I wrote with Matt Turner for the Journal of Economic Perspective. So what we do is we take the location of a household or the village, we draw draw a 5-kilometer disk around it, and we take the population density within that disk. So that's kind of the area in which you live. The second thing is you can define, as in this effort on urbanization, cities, towns, and rural areas as discrete units, and this is the kind of slide where cities have high population over 50,000 and density over 1,500, and then their towns and their rural areas. I'm not here obviously going to go through those definitions, and I think most of you have seen them a number of times. So what do we look at here? The first thing is household income from these 6 African countries. On the bottom axis is density in logs, and on the vertical axis is net income. These are sharper rises than you see for wages, so they include the fact that more people in the household are working, they have better jobs, better matched to their talents, and they work longer hours when they're in cities. So we see a rise, a gentle rise in some sense, up to about 400 people per square kilometer, and then a very sharp rise as we go from that up to the log of 10, which is 22,000 people per square kilometer. Not a lot of observations there. And the blue line is the regression line, and then the others are just lines I've drawn through these 2 segments. But you're looking at, a 3 to 5-fold increase in incomes. This is controlling the effects of age, gender, education, and the like. An interesting point to realize is that where people live in very concentrated locations differs around the world. So this is a graph with density here, and this is the share of the total population by density for different regions of the world listed at the bottom. So for the 7,500, I guess you can't see my cursor, but I can. If you look at North America, you've got 90% there, 90 plus, meaning that over 90% of the population lives at densities below 7,500. Whereas if you look at the bottom line, Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia at 7,500, you've only reached 50% of the population. Then when we go out to 20,000, which is a very high density, and you look at the developed world, the European Union and North America, that basically nobody lives above 20,000. I mean, a few little dots in Paris but they're just not there. Whereas you're looking at Sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia, there's another 20% that live in densities above 20,000. So we can't really learn what it's like to live at high densities without leaving the developed world and going to the less developed world. This is a graph relates to public services and how they vary with density. On the right is a utility, and graphs for electricity and safe water look the same. There's dramatic improvement here as in the share of people served as you move to higher density, again on that scale in logs. And it's very tight sort of band about the local fit because it's really supply. Everybody supplied this. On the left is the fraction of 16-year-olds completing 8 years of schooling. That rises. The regression line is shown. That's significant. But the error bands here about the local fit are a little wider because it's trying to separate out the effects of demographics from density. So utilities get better on that supply. The education part reflects not just public supply, but family choice of whether to send your kids to school and how quickly to do that and how much catch up there is for these kids. As this is 16-year-olds, just 8 years of schooling, not 10 or 12 years. And in Africa, there's quite a lag where people take a long time to get to that 8 years, but by 16, they're doing okay. We do the graphs that we have from the volume where I'm just going to look at the one on the right, the left, we have in the blue Sub-Saharan Africa and in the red South Asia. The dark is without any controls, the differences, and the light is with controls. it says here that for cities on the left in the circle compared to rural areas, this is the base, that there's this big increase in schooling achievement of children. It's a smaller gap when you do the demographic controls. And then in the red in South Asia, there's really no difference without controls. And with controls, it's actually negative. That's, you know, cities are offering slightly worse. And then the other part of that graph looks at towns. The urban bads. So this is what, in some sense, you know, you can go through a bunch of other characteristics here. I don't know if I've listed them. Fertility, modern contraception, vaccinations, all these are better outcomes in cities. But then there are the urban bads. So there's on the right is adult obesity. This is for the 40 countries worldwide, controlling for demographics. And we see this rise in obesity. The regression line, you know, fairly clear. The local fit even, you know, reasonably narrow and the like. On the left, it's diarrhea. The regression line is significant, but the local fit is pretty noisy. If we look at other indicators, crime goes up in cities, domestic violence marginally, child cough goes up. Infant mortality even appears in general to have a slight rise as density increases. Then we move here to just some results again from the volume, looking just at India, where these measures were only for India. High blood pressure, this is measured. Asthma, self-reported diabetes, you're diagnosed. And again, these are showing the differences on the left of these graphs for cities versus the rural areas, and on the right for towns versus the rural areas in India. And you know, the differences aren't that great, but they're really significant. So higher blood pressure in cities, higher asthma, higher diabetes, you know, these sort of urban stress, pollution, diet relative to the rural areas conditions. I don't know if these affect migration decisions, but I mean, they're sort of health outcomes in general, and whether people anticipate these or not, they do get it. And of course, they can always migrate back, which is not uncommon. As I said in the beginning, we found some differences by census status as to whether you're urban or not, and distinct differences between national capitals and provincial capitals versus other cities. And with this bias towards national and provincial capitals, that it certainly is affecting migration decisions. One thing to explore in that would be to whether that's lower in more democratic countries. So my summary, migration, is there money left on the table? The classic argument versus sort of the modern response that there are migration costs that and attachment costs to place that keep people from moving. There is the issues that services are better in denser places and also done at lower costs, but there is a political bias. And there's particularly the case in Africa, very poor services in certain dimensions in rural areas that seem to drive farmers to live in cities to get better services and probably so their family can get better jobs. And then we identified these urban bads, which has not been a focus at all in the literature. A lot of them health conditions, but also crime. So that's what I got to say.
Thank you very much, Professor Henderson. This was a very comprehensive insight on how I would say a lot of different phenomena interact within different degrees of urbanizations, from wealth to public service provision to living standards. And indeed, if I might make a comment which is also linked to the European experience, is the one related to what you said at the beginning of your presentation on the institutional context. So the fact that living in a national capital or a regional capital might make a difference, and actually it does for many countries. So thank you very much indeed. We will have time for discussion. I would suggest to go bank's approach to incorporating law. Can you hear me?
Now we can, thank you.
Yeah, you're coming in and out to me. But...
Oh, sorry. I was just inviting Benjamin Stewart to take the floor from the World Bank and talking about the World Bank's approach to incorporating urbanizations into measure of income and poverty. So, Benjamin, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. So I hope you guys can see my screen. I believe I've shared it. Okay, good. I see some nods, so I feel like I'm
yes, we do.
Doing something right. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity to present, and thanks for the opportunity to discuss sort of how the World Bank measures and uses measures of urban across our portfolio. I want to give a brief introduction of myself. My name is Benjamin Stewart. I'm the World Bank's senior geographer, leading the Geospatial Operational Support Team, or GHOST, in the DEC data group. We focus on integrating geospatial data into World Bank operations. And that happens in a lot of different ways, through direct analysis and tool development. We do a lot of data management, data access, and the maybe less interesting procurement support. But fundamentally, we really respond to requests from World Bank staff. So our work in urban has really grown from this, where we've worked with a number of urban economists. Mark Roberts, Sean McLaughlin, and Ellen Hamilton are sort of the ones that I have worked with the most. And they're really interested in trying to get objective measures of urban, rather than relying on our sort of established ad hoc definitions. Okay. So just a quick background of my interpretation of this is, this all started with the question of what is urban. The World Bank's country-focused approach to its operations, both from the sort of the lending portfolio and a lot of the analytic work, means that we often rely on national urban definitions. However, as everybody here knows, those definitions are inconsistent and often not well defined. This chart comes from a paper, I think, back in 2015 or 16, where we looked at the World Urbanization Prospectus and tried to sort of get a holistic sense of how different countries define these things. We found that 100 countries use some form of minimum population, but you can see from the spread that it's wildly different. There were only 10 countries at the time using a minimum or 9 countries at the time using a minimum population density threshold. However, I think it's the final 2 bullets that were the most common and interesting to me, where other criteria was included, things like economic activities, physical characteristics. But most often, our team is often sort of the last resort solution when no better data is available. So we're often given situations where countries simply list their urban areas rather than defining them by any objective criteria, and that can work in certain aspects of the kind of work the World Bank does, but as soon as we start to do any sort of large-scale comparisons, that completely falls apart. I want to provide a particular example in Haiti, because I think it's illustrative, but it's also the first time that I actually used the degree of urbanization methodology. So this was a project, I think, in 2015, where we went to work with the government in Haiti to design an urbanization review. We presented them the degree of urban methodology, but we faced quite a bit of opposition, I guess, from certain people who claimed that they had an existing definition, but we weren't ever really able to get it defined or provided to us. We found a map on the government website that simply, just like an ungeoreferenced PNG that which is what you're looking at here on the left, and we of sort of 5 categories of urban, ranging from very weak to very strong, and we had georeferenced it, digitized it, and then we were able to, once we had this, we were able to sort of overlay with what we had as from the degree of urbanization, to be able to actually do sort of an apples to apples comparison with their work. So we ended up with sort of a map like this that kind of looks at tried to approximate how they incorporated urban into their understanding. And truth be told, their urban definition was fundamentally different than what we were thinking of. For them, the admin 4 regions, which is what you're looking at here, every admin 3 region had to have an admin 4 region that was categorized as urban because that's where the tax base was. So our quantitative method left a lot of admin 3 regions without urban areas, which was frustrating and kind of impossible for a lot of the work they were doing. But this is an important fact, is that when we discuss urban, especially with quantitative standard methods, and discuss with our country counterparts, we're not always talking about the same things. I think that's incredibly important from our perspective, and important, I think, for sort of all of us to keep in mind as we think about sort of spreading new methodologies and explaining new tools, is that urban doesn't mean the same to everyone everywhere. And I think that we actually this ended up being a very great project once we understood that our quantitative definition was not meant to supplant their definition, but it was meant for us to be able to have a more consistent approach to what we thought of as urban. So a little bit more background of how the urban economists have thought about this. Should be said that I am not an urban economist. I'm very much a geographer. I stole this from a colleague who has done the actual work. But traditionally, a lot of urban economists haven't paid as much attention to the question of how cities are defined. There is a large remote sensing literature on it, and I think that's obvious. But that sort of the remote sensing literature does not always cross the floor into the economics world. But in the last decade or two, the increased availability of satellite imagery combined with increased urbanization in the developing world has led to a demand for uniform definitions. And I think that's where this discussion all started from. So a couple examples that I've worked on at the World Bank. We originally we've attempted to use other measures to look at urbanization with varying levels of success. So this was from 2013. So this was sort of before the degree of urbanization was quite ready, and actually the second year I worked at the institution. So we did a lot of work with nightlights, looking at the extent of urban footprints and how they changed over time. The long temporal catalog of nighttime lights made this attractive, and it all started with a project looking in India, I believe. But the inconsistency of electrification makes this inconsistent at a global scale, right? So that's an example of sort of a data set that was promising, and we still do rely on nighttime lights a lot. It's an incredibly valuable economic proxy in areas where we don't have good data. But as a definition of urban, it was really found lacking, which is where we got to where we ended up getting to the degree of urbanization as sort of the standard definition in the World Bank. And sort of the largest application of this was in the Latin American or LAC urbanization review, where there were it was really trying to assess this problem that two long held established facts that urbanization is positively correlated with economic development, and urbanization is negatively correlated with the size of the agricultural sector. But in Latin America, that just didn't seem to be the case, right? Latin America is more urbanized, the Caribbean is less urbanized, and what does that mean? How can we explain that? Why is Latin America not seeing the benefits of urbanization the same way a lot of the rest of the world is? So we compared two methods, the agglomeration index. So this was originally proposed by Uchida and Nelson in 2010, and it's combines population densities with travel time measures, where to the degree of urbanization, which relies solely on the population data set. So I think, as Professor Henderson said, I'm not going to spend a lot of time explaining what the density thresholds are for the degree of urbanization, but for the agglomeration index, for those of you who aren't familiar, it's a similar concept of thresholding gridded population data. We use a much lower threshold of 150 people per square kilometer, but we compare that to a drive time to, if you've seen the global data set on travel time to nearest city of 50,000 people, you sort of combine that and figure out if you meet the population threshold and are within 60-minute drive of a city, then you can see that's what we define as urban through the agglomeration index. There's immediately sort of a circular problematic issue here that in order to do the drive time analysis, you need to know where the cities of 50,000 are. So that isn't necessarily a great solution, but it's an interesting index and one that we had previously used a fair amount, and I think actually more and more we rely on the degree of urbanization because of this sort of the simplicity and consistency with which it can be calculated. I do want to mention this because I feel like it's a conclusion we draw every time somebody asks me to quantitative tests of urban, that the source data, gridded population data is more important than the methodology as far as agreement between various tests. So you can see here that the agglomeration index, the agreement between the agglomeration index across data sets is lower than the agreement across methodologies for the same data set, right? So the two areas in bold are comparing the agglomeration index with the European degree of urbanization methodology, and we can see that those are sort of the two highest agreements are where we use the same data sets, and that's consistent discussion point with colleagues is sort of like, what data do we use, and do we try many different data sets in order to see which one works best? It's a complicated discussion that really varies based on the region and country you're working in. So back to the results of that analysis of why is Latin America underperforming based on its urbanization, and I think the conclusion is that it's not necessarily that they're underperforming. The problem is that how they're measuring urban. So we can see here. Oh, those are backwards. We can see here in the blue we've highlighted the black bars here indicate the World Urbanization Prospectus urbanization rate, and then the red, yellow, and green represent the high density urban cells, and then the green is the rural. And you can see that Latin America, we see a lot of countries with very high stated levels of urbanization, much higher than we measure. But similarly, both Africa and South Asia have much lower measures of urban than we would expect based on. This is was the real sort of conclusion is that the underperforming urbanization in Latin America was much more a question of measurement than a question of actual underperforming urbanization. All that to be said, what are we doing now? How are we looking to move forward with our current applications of these sort of standardized measures of urban, and how will we sort of improve their use over time? First, I want to talk about sort of integration into our standard analytical products. We're really trying to integrate these standard measures of urban into our products. If anyone's familiar with our systematic country diagnostics, or SCDs, they're a standard product, and it's an important sort of holistic assessment of the economic nature of the country, and it feeds into the sort of the framework agreements that the bank forms with countries. I always like to say there's nothing systematic about our systematic country diagnostics. I see it as a real problem, and I think something like the urbanization work could be a standard product that we incorporate into that in a consistent way. I think it's a more and more of these SCDs want to do international comparisons, and that's when you start to realize the real value of something like the degree of urbanization. Second, I think that as World Bank projects become increasingly cross-sectoral, a holistic understanding of what is urban is necessary, not just in the urban for urban economists, right? We have transport economists and health economists who are interested in these classifications of urban. And you can see here this map where this is an infrastructure product, the standard analytical product, or InfraSAP. And the cities here we derive from the degree of urbanization, and we're trying to measure access to markets, right? So the actual analytical product is not focused on urban, but we need to understand urban to understand almost everything we do. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about some of the work that our poverty unit is attempting to standardize measures of urban to better understand the distribution of poverty. So this is hot off the presses. My colleague Shohei Nakamura presented this to me yesterday. So if you see the chart at the bottom, the labels don't line up. That's because I think he just produced it the day before. But really, what we're trying to do is understand, based on household survey data, how sort of quantitative measures of urban differ from the standard measures of urban that we get from the country, and how that affects our understanding of poverty, right? So we can see here in the box on the left, the cost of living is highest in urban centers and it's lowest in rural areas, expected. The urban classification at the top there is sort of a grouping of the urban centers and urban clusters. We're still trying to understand how to best communicate all that. But we can see in the chart, not only is the comparison of for the food price index, the comparison of urban and rural, there's a difference, but that difference is not consistent across the country. And I think that Professor Henderson mentioned that as well. You know, regional differences are important to understand, and I think that this is something that we're looking to do more. And one of the things that I'm most interested in, as far as this goes for World Bank operations, is if we get a better understanding of how urban affects the distribution of welfare and income and poverty, should that fundamentally change how we design our household surveys, right? Should that fundamentally change how we design our sampling frameworks? And I think that's something that our survey solutions team is quite interested in, is sort of basing this survey design on gridded population data as opposed to sort of established enumeration areas working with NSOs. So I think that's just about time for me. So thanks a lot. I've got my email up there if you want to contact me, and also the email for the Ghost team if anybody has any more questions. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. Point. I see that my connection might not be stabilized, so I switch off my video. One point is the deep interconnection between data, definitions, and decisions. So policy decisions that are taken on the basis of definitions, and definitions that are shaped on the basis of the data you have. So that is very, very key to the issue. And the second one is something that is very close to my heart and to our philosophy of dealing with cities or understanding cities in the Joint Research Center, which is the need of a holistic understanding of what is urban, and try to put things together, understand what are trade-offs, what are win-wins also between different disciplines, different policy domains. That is, I think, a very important issue that we all need to have in mind. So thanks a lot. Let's move, and thanks to both the speakers for adjusting their time to the needs. So it's 15 minutes each. Great job. So let's move to the third speaker. It's Johan van der Valk from Statistics Netherlands. Johan will talk about using the labor force survey to produce indicators for metropolitan area. So Johan, please, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. I will try to share my screen. Do you see my presentation or?
No, not yet.
Not yet, okay. Then I push the button. Yeah, this should work. Yes, you see it now?
Yes, it does. Yes, okay. Perfect.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm Johan van der Valk of Statistics Netherlands. I have a long-standing experience in working on the labor force survey. A couple of which years I was seconded at Eurostat, at the Statistical Office of the European Union. And recently I have been working on to develop regional statistics. We carried out a project for the European Commission, and that is what I will talk about. It was a project called City Data from LFS and Big Data. It was a project for statistical institutes, and we carried this out in 2018. I led the project from Statistics Netherlands, and the other countries that were in the consortium were Germany, Austria, France, and Belgium. And we looked at two sources of data: the labor force survey, what you can do with that for functional urban areas, and we worked on mobile phone data, and we published a final report. And if you receive the presentation, you can click on the link, and then you can get access to the final report. I will talk about the labor force survey. What did we do for this part of the project? We looked at the possibilities of using the LFS to produce regional information. And for this, the consortium members, they prepared their LFS data to produce indicators for functional urban areas and to look at what are the problems they're doing so, or what are the possibilities. And in addition, we had a workshop where we gathered all LFS experts from the European Union, where we discussed on the work that the consortium members did, and we discussed further what you can do with the labor force survey for regional data. To show what is possible and what is interesting is I show here the example of Belgium. They made so they used the labor force survey to produce employment rates for the functional urban areas. And here you see in the middle you see the functional area of Brussels. And in the middle you have the Brussels capital, and the nice thing was that if you produce indicators, for instance, the employment rate, the result is, and it's not surprisingly, but it was a very interesting result that the employment rate for the functional urban area, Brussels and the surrounding regions or municipalities, there the employment rate is much higher than the employment rate if you look at the Brussels capital only. And this has to do, of course, with that a lot of people are working outside of the Brussels capital and living outside of the Brussels capital and working inside the Brussels capital, and so the population is totally different. Also, the economic performance is then different, but and the colleague of Belgium said that unfortunately policies, they are limited to the administrative boundary, so they are limited to Brussels capital only, and the others. It's even part of different governments in Belgium. But it clearly shows that how interesting the results are if you consider the functional urban area rather than only the municipalities. And you can use the labor force survey to show where what are the differences. So we concluded that the labor force survey can provide information on indicators like the activity rate, employment rate, unemployment rate, educational attainment. You can even have indicators on the types of employment, so self-employed, employees, or full-time, part-time employed, or temporary contracts. These kind of things are possible with the labor force survey. And you can even have a breakdown in broad categories of persons, so by sex or by age, or even the educational attainment into a limited sense. So these are the richness of the labor force survey, and they are all harmonized. So if you produce indicators with this, you can compare this within the whole of Europe and even with the developed countries in the rest of the world. So these are it's a powerful source. The only drawback is that it is based on a survey and a sample survey. This means that if that you have only limited possibilities to make it for regional detail. And there, our conclusion was that for larger regions, so the metropolitan areas, the LFS provides within the countries that we investigated within Europe, the sample sizes are large enough to produce indicators. They are more or less comparable with NUTS2 regions where the samples are based on for the EU LFS. For the smaller regions, the LFS is not appropriate. So the sample survey the errors are too large to produce data on this, and particularly the NUTS3 regions were things that were important, were discussed, and there was hope that we can use that one could use that at NUTS3 level, but the experts consider this as too small to produce. For some countries it is maybe possible, but most of the European countries, the NUTS3 regions, are too small to provide information on. The other important element is that the experts draw our attention onto quality issues. So the sample and weighting systems of the labor force survey is fully based on NUTS 3 regions as the lowest regional detail. So for all other regions, they are not necessarily representative. And so to have better quality data, it is recommended to do additional weighting to population totals. If you make, for instance, for the data on metropolitan area, functional urban areas, so additional weighting is necessary. And also unemployment. I had a question mark here. I didn't tell you about it. I had a question mark here. So for the unemployment rate in many European countries and certain regions, the unemployment is quite low. And this means that the samples are also small for this indicator. And therefore the sample error are quite large, and therefore it was recommended to use methods of small area estimation and where you use also auxiliary information, and thereby you can have more stable and better indicators. This is also possible to use for other indicators. And for this small area estimation, extra work has to be done. This is not standard work, and it's not on the European level available. But it is it is possible, and one can ask statistical institutes to do this kind of work. The summary is that you can use the LFS to produce indicators for large areas, relatively large regional areas like metropolitan areas, and a comprehensive set of labor market indicators. It is, as I told you just now, that it's important to think about improving the quality for regional data by using reweighting or small area estimation techniques. This is my presentation. If you have questions afterwards, you can always contact me by email afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johan, and thanks for zooming into a very specific example of I would say connections between methods, data, and areas on which those data make more sense or less sense, and show how complex this is, even for one single example. I would just like to say that you can use the chat for the questions and answers, so we can collect the questions in the chat, and we can move now to the fourth and last presentation. So I'm pleased to welcome to the floor Friedrich Hübler. He's head of the Education Standards and Methodology section at UNESCO Institute for Statistics. And Friedrich will talk about measures of urban educational attainment in the UIS database. So please, Friedrich, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me first try to share my screen. Can you see my slide?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. So, well, thank you for this opportunity to tell you about some of the work by the UNESCO Institute for Statistics. I would like to start with an overview of the work by the US and the SDG 4 monitoring framework. So Sustainable Development Goal 4 on education has a total of 43 global and thematic indicators. And the UNESCO Institute of Statistics is the custodian agency for most of these indicators. Our data come from administrative records. This is mainly done through our annual survey of formal education that is sent to all member states, but we also collect and disseminate data from household surveys, population censuses, and learning assessments. Indicators that can be disaggregated are mainly disaggregated by sex, but we also have started more recently.
Friedrich, excuse me, we cannot see the presentation anymore. I don't know what has happened.
Let's see.
Yeah.
It's back?
It's back on the screen, yes.
Sorry about that. So I was talking about the data sources by the UIS, and I was just talking about the data that are disaggregated. Most of the indicators that are disaggregated only by sex, but we have more recently placed an emphasis on additional disaggregations, and that's why we also have data disaggregated by location. This is some of the statistics that I will present today for urban and rural areas. We also disaggregate some indicators by household wealth and other dimensions such as migration or disability status. There are three indicators that I will present today. I will talk about the literacy rate, the educational attainment rate, and the completion rate. So the literacy rate is, of course, not strictly speaking a measure of educational attainment, but it is an indicator that is still very relevant for many developing countries because of the information that it provides about access to basic education. So starting with the literacy rate, that is defined as the proportion of the population in an age group that can read and write, and is typically just reading a simple statement about everyday life. So it's really a very basic literacy measure, and the most common indicator here is the adult literacy rate that's calculated for the population 15 years and older. In this map, we can see adult literacy rate in urban areas for countries for which the US has data. And you can see that in urban areas, the literacy rate is generally very high at 90% or higher, although there are some countries, mainly in Africa and Southern Asia, where even urban literacy rates are significantly lower than in other countries. The next map shows you the disparity between urban and rural areas with regard to the adult literacy rates. This is done by the location parity index. This is the ratio of the rural divided by the urban literacy rate. So if this ratio is around 1, you would have parity between both areas, and that's indicated with this light blue shading. I don't know if you can see my mouse, probably not. We have that mostly in countries in Europe and Central Asia. In most other countries, the rural literacy rate is much lower than the urban literacy rates, and in the countries that are shaded in this dark red, the urban literacy rate is at least twice as high as the rural literacy rate. Next indicator is the educational attainment rate. That's the proportion of a population that has completed at least a given level of education. And to give an example, this could be the proportion of the population that's 25 years or older with at least completed primary education. Here, I'm looking again at data for urban areas. The UIS has this data for 135 countries, and I have to emphasize that the values that you see here are unweighted mean values across those 135 countries, because the UIS has not yet incorporated estimates of the urban and rural population into its database that could be used to calculate weighted mean values that would be representative for those 135 countries. And I also should mention something that Benjamin talked about earlier. We rely here on national definitions of urban and rural. So, but when we look at this data, we can see that on average, about 86% of the urban population in those 135 countries have completed primary education, and those values decline as we look at attainment of higher levels of education. So 74% for lower secondary, 58% for upper secondary, and 26% for tertiary education. This pattern can also be observed at the regional level. This graph shows data by SDG region, the same indicator, the primary, lower secondary, upper secondary, and tertiary completion rate. And we can see here that only in 2 regions, Europe and Northern America, close to 100% of the adult urban population have completed at least primary education. In other regions, those values are lower, and we have the lowest educational attainment in sub-Saharan Africa, where only 2/3 of the urban population that is 25 or older has completed at least primary education. And there are significant gaps in all regions between the primary completion rate and the completion rates for higher levels of education. The final indicator that I will present is the completion rate. This is also a measure of educational attainment. The calculation method is in fact the same, but the completion rate is calculated for a different age group. It's calculated for the population 3 to 5 years above the official age of entry into the last grade of the given level of education, and we're looking at that age group and see has it completed that level. This is easier to understand with an example. So assume that you have a country where the primary school age is 6 to 11 years. In that case, the primary completion rate would be calculated for the population that's 3 to 5 years older than 11, so 14 to 16 years. And we look within that age group which proportion has completed primary education. Again, this is also a measure of educational attainment, but it looks at the younger age group and at a much narrower age group. And this is also done for primary, lower secondary, and upper secondary age. So if I maybe just go back here for a moment to the attainment rate for the population 25 and older, you see that these values are considerably lower than the completion rates. And of course, this is due to the fact that younger populations have had more opportunity to attend school and to complete individual levels of education. So what is interesting here is that in nearly all regions, primary completion rates are very high. It's generally at or above 90%, again, with the exception of sub-Saharan Africa, where less than 80% of the population just above primary age have completed primary education. Lower secondary completion rates are also very high and generally close to primary completion rates, but there is a drop-off as we go to upper secondary education. Those completion rates are typically lower and sometimes significantly lower than the completion rates for primary and lower secondary education. This graph compares completion rates in rural and urban areas. So along the horizontal axis, I've plotted the completion rate in rural areas, and along the vertical axis, the completion rate in urban areas. Each country here is represented by 3 markers for primary, lower secondary, and upper secondary completion. For the main point is not really the distribution by region or by level of education, but the overall difference between urban and rural completion rates. So you can see that in virtually all countries, urban completion rates are higher than rural completion rates. This is not really surprising because there is a better education infrastructure in urban areas. Incomes are generally higher. But what is perhaps surprising is that in some countries that you see in the upper right corner and below the 45-degree line, rural completion rates are high. And this is especially true for some countries in Europe, where the upper secondary completion rate is lower in urban areas and also in some countries of Latin America. So we see that there are disparities between regions and also between urban and rural areas. But finally, I want to show that there are also disparities within urban areas. This first example looks at gender parity with regard to the completion rate in urban areas. And on the horizontal axis, you have the parity index of the urban completion rate. And the gender parity index is calculated by dividing the female completion rate by the male completion rate. If that value, the result of that calculation is about 1, countries are located within this shaded rectangle that you see a bit to the right of the graph. So countries within this shaded area have achieved gender parity. The female and male completion rates are the same. As the overall completion rate is near 100%, of course, you no longer observe disparity. If everyone goes to school, there can be no difference between boys and girls. But we see that overall, gender disparity is really widespread. countries to the left of this gender parity area are those where girls have lower completion rates, and those countries to the right of the shaded area are those where boys have higher completion rates. So there isn't really a clear trend that gender disparity with regard to the completion rate in urban areas can go both ways. This looks very different when we look at disparity linked to household wealth. This is indicated by those blue markers here. Here we see that in nearly all cases, the poorest 20% of the population have far lower completion rates than the richest 20%. And the disparity is also much bigger than that linked to gender, where you have in the left half of the graph, you have many more observations where there are basically no observations with low or high gender disparity. There's very high disparity linked to household wealth. And also what's interesting here is that this disparity even exists at very high overall completion rates. So even in countries where the overall completion rate in urban areas is 80% of high, you still observe a lot of disparity between the richest and the poorest wealth quintile. To summarize, the completion rate and the attainment rate can provide some information on human capital. We saw that attainment rates are typically higher in urban areas. We saw that there are large differences between SDG regions, but in addition to that, we also saw that in addition to those disparities between urban and rural areas and between SDG regions, there are still disparities within urban areas that are linked to gender, wealth, and other dimensions of disaggregation. I also would like to mention two additional indicators that provide information on human capital. These are indicators 411 and 461. 411 is an indicator that provides information on literacy and numeracy skills of children in school. SDG indicator 461 provides the same kind of information, literacy and numeracy skills, but for the adult population. Future work by the UIS in this area is mainly focused on increased coverage. We are trying to have data for more countries and also more recent data for countries. So you can find this in our data at the link that I'm showing here on this slide. We are also looking at the possibility of calculating weighted averages for urban and rural indicators. That means incorporating population estimates for those areas which we don't have yet. And we're also considering additional levels of disaggregation. For example, we are currently working on education statistics linked to migration or linked to disability status. If you have any questions about the US data, you can contact me in this email address. And again, here's also the link to our website where you can find all our data. Thank you very much.
UNESCO on educational attainment indicators and how a combination of data, additional information can really shed lights and give insights that get to probably, I would say, give support to specific policy decisions in the end that can be really based on detailed and clearer evidence. So thanks a lot for this. We now have quite some time for questions and answers. I invite those who wish to ask questions to the speakers to raise their hands, and I have tried to chat. I have seen that there have been a number of, we have I think now two questions in the chat. One is from Paulius Kulikauskas, which is going into kind of the same direction I was going into, understanding the link between these measurements. And would you like to say a few words on your questions? On your question?
Are you asking me, Alessandro?
Yeah, just to illustrate your question, maybe, if you wish.
Yeah, well, very briefly, you know, we have seen today, but also in other circumstances, that the critical mass of approaches and tools to measure very different aspects of urbanization have become and are still becoming available. But for us, it's only not to measure what has happened historically in terms of the development of different aspects or services or employment or economic performance, but we badly need to establish linkages. When we look at the data over time, and we can look at the policies that have been applied in different contexts to understand and measure how certain policies can be promoted to help, especially the developing and the least developed countries, to harness what we call, maybe it's very loud, but the transformative power of urbanization. So I wanted to ask the speakers if they have any ideas on the next steps that we should take towards making this possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paulus. So please, any of the people like to take this question up and say a few words?
So I can say something here from my perspective. So I think that a major part of what we have done previously and what I think would be valuable is rather than sort of is about capacity building and knowledge transfer with our colleagues in national statistics offices. I think it's one of my favorite things I've done with the World Bank is working with sort of supporting a census and folks like that, because, you know, especially with something like the degree of urbanization, which is really quite simple. I think that it's important. I think what's important when we do this sort of conversations is not necessarily the idea of I always tell people, like, we don't want to tell countries that their definition of urban is wrong. It's just not the definition of urban that maybe we're looking at. And I think what's important in the capacity building and discussion is not that we sort of change how people are measuring urban, but that we try and encourage countries to be measuring urban, to be quantitative in that assessment. How you do that is up to you, but I think that's where I see a lot of our work moving forward, and the World Bank has a particular interest in this because we interact with so many NSOs on a regular basis. I think Lewis has started moving that direction as well, and is doing some great work with sort of the capacity building side of this, and that's where I could see a lot of the major gains happening, is if we can sort of encourage our countries to be better custodians of that data. Because even in the sort of the data poor countries, I think they have a lot more information, and they have a lot more local information that we have access to. It. So that's where I would see some work should be going, and I think that that relates to both the sort of the urbanization metrics, but also larger geospatial and remote sensing and Earth observation based training to make some of these tools and methods more accessible.
I might.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. Yeah, please.
I might jump in here with a comment, which is, as we have discovered working in Africa, Ben is right, these countries have a lot of data that one only gets by spending time there, and probably getting under the table in many cases, that which is harder for international organizations. But regardless of that, I think that we know something about how incomes vary across space, something about how service delivery varies, something about cost of living generally quite badly, and having surveying, more comprehensive surveying, maybe like the bank's living standard surveys that are now just in, I think, 6, 7, maybe it's expanded a bit, countries, having that more widespread, or encouraging the DHS, of course, that's a separate entity and focused more on health outcomes, but they gather enormous amounts of information. They construct a wealth index. They could do a better job on that. The extent that we can have better survey information to, you know, we're not going to get it out of a census. Even in the US now, we're not going to get it out of a census. This is going to take big surveys. They're costly. But it gives us a lot of information about disparities and what's really going on. And, you know, we would like to know about income differences. We'd like to know about real cost of living differences, and we're very limited in what we know.
Any other comment to this question? Okay, let's move to the next question. It's a question to Hübler directly. Maybe Alice, would you like to just illustrate your question? It's quite straightforward, but
yes. I mean, I think we know that of course the pandemic has highly affected the access to education. And from what I was able to understand from early statistics, for example, from Eurostat, we know that this might affect more areas that are not well connected digitally. So I was wondering if, since I was very impressed by one of the last slides on the gender issue, the gender disparities as well in urban. So I was wondering if you are already working on that at UNESCO, if you have early data, and because I think this is could really affect those statistics more in the next year. So that was the question. Thank you.
I was looking for my microphone. Hi. Yes, we have the UIS with partners. So this includes UNICEF, the World Bank, and OECD has conducted a series of surveys on the impact of COVID-19 on education systems. I put the link to our COVID-19 website in the chat. And I just looked at the questionnaires. There are not, unfortunately, any questions that specifically look at the difference between urban and rural areas. There is in a most recent survey that we carried out, this is called let me look again at the official title, the survey for monitoring impact on main education data aggregates. So you will find the link on that page. I'm going to actually put that particular link in the chat too. This survey also did not ask specifically about urban and rural areas, but it did attempt to collect information by administrative region. The results are not yet available, but I think when you look at that data, you should be able to identify areas that would be more rural, and you could look at differences then between, let's say, the capital region and some of the more rural areas. But specifically, questions about urban and rural data were not included in any of those surveys.
Thank you. Luis has a question for Friedrich. Luis.
Yes. Hi. So, oops, are you still there? Yeah. So one of the ways that we were able to code the DHS results by degree of urbanization was because there was a specific location or cluster attached to all the respondents. It was randomized a bit to maintain anonymity, but the geolocation of the survey respondent is incredibly useful. So I was wondering, do the surveys UNESCO work with, have they moved to geocoding the respondents? And if so, where are those locations kept? Are they kept in the country or are they shared with UNESCO? I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you. The main survey by UNESCO, the main survey, for example, the annual survey of formal education is a nationwide survey. So there is no information on any subnational areas, not even at the, let's say, a different administrative regions. So there is no geocoding because it is plain data for the total population, how many children go to school, what is the literacy rate, how many teachers are there, what is education spending. The other surveys that I mentioned, the COVID-19 surveys, are also not geocoded. There is really, again, just that one example that I mentioned where we try to collect data on administrative region. But otherwise, we are relying, like some of the other presentations that we saw today, we're looking at DHS data, mixed data, LSMS, and other surveys. And of course, there we would have the geocoded information.
Thank you, Friedrich. Any other question? Anyone raising hands or writing a question in the chat?
I wouldn't mind asking a question or making a comment.
Yeah.
This is on the education data from Regix, which was really great. The one thing that we observed in sub-Saharan Africa, this was looking at 16-year-olds who have completed 8 years, that there was a really sharp increase as you went from 14, 15 to 16, that there were people who stayed in school that were older at lower grades and persisted and finished you know, the 8th grade by the time they were 16. I was really surprised because you think, well, if you haven't done it by, you know, whatever, a certain age, then you're it's no good. But it's the same with primary, that there was just people staying in school to achieve something, either completion of primary or completion of middle school, and did that. So I wouldn't, you know, it's not, I know you've got an age range, but it would be nice to look at just an upper limit that allows these people to persist. Just a comment.
Can I comment on that?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
That is an interesting observation, and the fact that the reason why the completion rate is defined as it is, so it looks at the age group 3 to 5 years older than the official age of graduation. The reason is because we have phenomena like late entry and repetition for many years in countries like in Africa, where children take significantly longer to complete certain levels of education, and therefore the completion rate is a delayed measure to not punish those countries, like countries in Africa, that would have significantly lower completion rates if we look exactly at the age at the upper end of primary, lower secondary, upper secondary education. So we'll allow them to catch up. That's why it's defined that way.
Thank you both. I think Luis would like to jump in, please.
Yeah, the kind of the impetus from this workshop came from a very simple observation. If we looked at the SDG 11 indicator and well, the goal and its indicators, we had a number of physical, environmental indicators, but we didn't really have a single economic indicator. So the goal here was to think, okay, if we wanted to know 1 or 2 numbers that captured really the economic dynamism or impact of cities in a country, what number would that be? I think through the presentations, we've seen a couple of numbers that could help, right? It could be the educational attainment, it could be the employment rate. If you have a really detailed survey like SMS, you can do income, or if we could estimate poverty rates or cost of living. You know, I think there's a cloud of numbers there floating around which can help us to interpret the economic role of cities. But I'm challenging our audience here, you know, give me your favorite one or your top 2 or 3 if you could. I mean, this is where you know, we're trying to get.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Luis, for getting into the last item on the agenda, which is actually the discussion with this blunt question. I mean, what indicators are needed to measure economic development of cities? So I think this question is open not only to the speakers, but to all the so just contribution is really well. Anyone wants to say something?
I'm an economist, so I like to see wage rates and incomes, right, and cost of living, but that's just hard data to get. I mean, employment rates are obviously important, and there's an issue, of course, how you measure that, especially in rural areas. Are you employed in paid work? Are you employed in family work? Are you employed so many hours? But just thinking about how people are doing, you know, conditional on their education, you think it's, you know, household income, and you probably want to look at wage rates as well. Both, to me, those are super important. The cost of living is hard, but also really important. But, you know, that's hard data. It's expensive.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Please.
Okay. Yes. No, I had more. Yeah, it's more a comment also on the presentation from Johan, because I mean the attempt to use the LFS was very interesting. We had been looking at it when we were trying to understand which indicators we could propose to cities to measure their performance also on the SDGs. But still we have issues because, as you pointed out, even the ones that you calculated, you recommended to use it only for metropolitan areas or cities and greater cities. So I was wondering where is here the solution as well, because we don't have a clear, also in those databases, we have a lot of data gaps, even in Europe. So I can imagine how hard it could be to try to propose this also at global scale in the SDG framework. So I don't know if Johan, you have additional thought on that, but just a question for you. Thank you.
Well, the problem here is that things are possible, but they involve some extra work. So the legal framework of the LFS just provides data on NUTS2 regions, and that's all that the member states provide to Eurostat. But of course, for the micro data allows much more possibilities to use also other regions. But this is extra work. So some countries do this because for national users, and others don't. And so it is a potential, but it has to be organized. And there's a lot of a cold water fear of countries doing this. They say, oh, but the samples are not perfect, and then the quality is not optimal. And other countries say, well, we do it and it works quite nice. So these are the differences, and it's. But the real issue is how can you organize this, that this is done on an international level. There I do not have the answer. I only from a statistician working on the microdata in the Netherlands. I know it is possible. But it's not done, and the type of extra activity, so reweighting or small area estimations, there it is also you can develop universal methods that it's not a lot of work. The only thing is that it has to be done by the member states themselves, and it's not a lot of work, but it is extra work. And maybe it would be good to organize some assistance to make it easier for them. And I always promote in every international meeting where I am to use the method of constructive collaboration. So show a few countries that that do this work, and that it can be done, and it gives good results in the hope that others will follow. But Theodora and Louis, they know all about this, but so it can be done, but you have to move the statistical officers to start working on this.
Yeah, thank you, Johan. Luis, please.
Yeah, to pick up on that vein, I mean, obviously, depending on the countries we're working in, there are different options, right? And one of the attractive options emerging in a number of European countries is the registers. If the registers are well maintained and up to date and linked to other information, you can really extract a lot of data from that with very precise location information, right? So that really makes a number of things easier. Denmark knows the education of every single person registered in their country, in their population register. You know, linking it to tax gives some kind of indication of whether they have paid taxes on income from work. You know, so you know at least if they are working. You might not know the number of hours through that, but so there is a potential to get more higher resolution data. I think one of the challenges for LFS to start producing in Europe more reliable and data across the board is, first of all, an integration or considering how that needs to affect the sampling frame. And there we need more data on who actually lives in the city, not just total, but, you know, age, sex, education, all these type of things that you need for the sampling frame. And then indeed, you need a weighting scheme to make sure or a small area estimations to make these numbers as reliable as possible. So that's definitely, you know, something that I think in Europe we should invest in. More generally, I actually think that geocoding a survey is a very low-cost way of being able to aggregate it in a different way. We've been able to use a number of surveys, including the Gallup World Poll, where in face-to-face interviews, they just record the location, right? I mean, they're there anyway. All they need to do is hit a button on a GPS and then they have the location. And it works pretty darn well. I mean, okay, occasionally you don't get the location, but with that, you can start regrouping respondents in different classes, including by degree of urbanization. And I think that is really a very powerful method. But again, there also the question is, well, if we're going to group them, should that be part of the sampling frame? Now, I'm not a statistician, so I don't fully comprehend how this all works, but I understand that for more reliable estimates, that should be an important aspect to do. So in short, I think the combination of location and register information will make it a lot easier to get better spatially disaggregated information everywhere.
Yeah, thank you, Luis. I think there is an invitation launched by Paulus to Philip Stein to share his views. So, Philip, I would be pleased to leave the floor to you.
Hi, everyone. I've really enjoyed listening to this, but it's a little bit above my technical level. I've written something in the chat. You know, in my opinion, it's very difficult to find a quick fix in this area. That's what indicators are about, as far as I'm concerned, to give us a very concise and reliable piece of work to make our assessment and then work towards action. So I thought the LFS was very interesting in that respect. But as Johan said, I don't know. You know, I say that quite honestly. If that would be reliable, as you said, Johan, on an international, on a global basis. But it seems to me something that would be worth investigating further. But that's pretty much the limit of my knowledge on this aspect, I'm afraid.
Thanks a lot, Philip. Johan, yes, please.
Can I say something about this? So, in fact, the labor force survey is one of the advantages that the methods are relatively harmonized. So the definitions are harmonized worldwide using the ILO definition, and that is one of the advantages of using this source. But the regional detail is the weak point here.
Yeah, Lewis.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on a point from Paula in the chat, and yeah, this is really an incredibly hard nut to crack. It's the measurement of the difference in cost of living. We're not even there at the national level, in all honesty, in Europe. We don't have good, reliable comparisons of cost of living across the Union. One of the hardest ones is housing costs. We really don't have good information that covers both the rental and the for sale market. We don't have good quality information to see how the evolution over time in prices is reflected in quality or not. So this is really challenging. For example, in statistics on income and living condition, we do produce regional estimates of poverty. We produce estimates of poverty by degree of urbanization, but that doesn't take into account any regional or urban differences of cost of living. Even the difference between people who own their house outright and do not pay a mortgage and people who pay a mortgage or people who are renting is not considered when we calculate EU poverty rates. So for me, those are major shortcomings of this measure, because as we know, houses cost more in cities in general and fewer people own them and more people rent. So if we're not taking that into account, we're likely to underestimate urban poverty rates substantially. And that, again, varies between countries, so that bias is of varying size between countries. So I think it's a really challenging aspect. I'm very happy that the JRC and ECFIN and OECD are trying to make inroads in getting better data on housing costs, at least, which in Europe is probably the main determinant of differences in cost of living. But there's still a long road to go. Just getting the information on current availability doesn't tell you anything about people who bought their house 10 years ago or 30 years ago, or what people who have their rents locked in for a long period of time. So I think there we need to find a much richer source of information to really capture cost of living differences in a reliable way. And so I think that's really probably the hardest one to capture.
Yeah, thank you, Lewis. Paola, would you like to make a comment on this?
Yes, thank you, Luis. No, I was thinking just to something simpler to start with. Maybe look at the comparison between, look just at the variation, for example, in the same city. You not consider the absolute for the moment, since we don't know if a person is owns the house or not, rent or not, but just look at, let's say, average house price in a certain neighborhood and compare it with the average house price in another neighborhood. And so just consider the difference to have a measure not of poverty, but of a distribution of wealth in a city, let's say, a distribution of, let's say, neighborhoods of concentration of people with a certain, let's say, possibility in a certain neighborhood. It's not precise, of course, but since we don't have data, no, we have to start somewhere. So maybe just looking at, for example, the difference across neighborhoods in a city is already something to start. Then, of course, we need to work a lot on all the topic you mentioned, but just to start from somewhere I'm thinking the database that Riccardo and Giorgi, our colleague from the Unit B3 now, are collecting and analyzing. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's basically a very good idea. I mean, the things we need to tackle to really get a comprehensive picture are very long, so the sooner we start, the better. But I also expect that we're going to have to make some changes of a more regulatory nature, right? Some countries have started by releasing information about dwellings sold per municipality, right? If we also combine, if we made that mandatory across the EU, if there was a standardized information about the size and the quality of those dwellings, you know, we would be making substantial improvements. If we monitoring the availability on the rental market, again, helpful. But if we could get more information about the people who are already renting, you know, another good step. But I think understanding the differences between neighborhoods in terms of types of amenities and the quality of the housing and the cost of the housing is a great way to start.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think we might have time for last contribution. Anyone would like to take the floor? No? Okay, so maybe I would just say a last word, which is an apology, because I have noticed that my connection was not very stable, so I had to jump in and out with my video. Not not a huge problem, but I hope that has not much affected my ability to moderate this session. I think it has been well, it's been for me a pleasure and a real opportunity to know more and to really try to figure out collectively how best we can move forward. I think that was the main purpose of this meeting. Try to find reasonable ways to move forward. I have listened to the usual trade-off between you know, having good data, meaningful data, and not spending so much money to get those data and time to get them. So this is always a nice trade-off and a nice challenge for all of us to tackle. But I have not seen any particular warning from Annika, so I think that everything's fine to give the floor to Luis for his closing remarks. So please, Luis, I'm happy to give you the floor. Great.
Thank you, Ale. And no, I had no issues with your moderation, even though I couldn't see your face. But then I do know what you look like, so
yeah, I'm not George Clooney, actually.
Well. So closing remarks. I really enjoyed this. I thought it was a good combination of different sources, different geographic scales, different issues. My key question, you know, what's the key metric to measure the economic impact for cities in an efficient way is still a challenging one to answer. I think the labor force survey is a very promising place to start. It's a relatively short survey. It's used in many countries. If we can get the location, we can code them by degree of urbanization. I do think it's useful to include things like, is it part-time or is it more full-time? Are you an employee or are you self-employed? Get the sector, you know, what type of work do you know, what type of company do you work for? Or are you a subsistence farmer? I think that's key. I think cost of living is challenging, as Ben also in his presentation showed. Income or wages, very challenging also, but would be very useful, because I think one of the biggest impacts of agglomeration economies is definitely on the city, you know, on the wages, where you would see that mostly. If we could get more information on cost of living, then you would also start to see how much it's worth to somebody to live in a particular place, which should also provide an indication of how much more they're expecting or hoping to earn there. So again, that could be another way of capturing it. The last conclusion I would draw is basically the UN endorsed the degree of urbanization, the UN Statistical Commission, a year ago. We've approved the manual on how to apply this definition now. And so now we're really looking at a number of custodian agencies whenever it says urban rural. And yes, Friedrich, I'm looking at you. It should say as defined by degree of urbanization, because then we at least also have a harmonized measure. I do think it's important, I think Ben alluded to that very well, is that this does not replace national urban and rural definitions. They have their own role, they have their own history, that they have their own value. This is not a competition. This is just complementary to make it easier to compare across countries. So we'll be taking another hard look at SDGs and seeing where we see an opportunity to insert the degree of urbanization to facilitate international comparisons. And I think we can collectively make more progress there. With that, thank you very much. And that's it for me.
Thank you very much, Lewis. Thank you very much to all of you. It has been a great. I would leave the floor to Annika for the last word. I think UN Habitat, the host, deserves to say goodbye to all at least.
Well,
so on my side, thank you all.
I would like to thank specifically Alessandro, who came on board as our moderator, skilled moderator, and to all the presenters. I know that Vernon was in the middle of a move, for example, of moving houses, and some people have connected from the US and Canada where it's very early. So thanks for getting up early for us. And it was a pleasure seeing you this week. And maybe we'll meet for next edition, and who knows, perhaps physically in Brussels around lunch and a beer even. So thanks to all, and have a good day and a good afternoon. And we'll share the presentations and the summary of the meeting.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.